Welcome to the latest episode in the IEA's Zero In series with me, Syed Kamall. I'm the Academic and Research Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Now, in this series, we've previously been joined by guests from the world of academia, business people, economists, to discuss the UK's legal commitment to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And we've also discussed an array of issues and solutions around the environmental agenda, from Pigouvian taxes to renewable energy, to the fundamental question of whether targets are necessary or achievable. For example, will 2050 be another target that passes us by? What are the free market or the least interventionist solutions to tackling some of the environmental problems that we see today? What policy levers could be pulled? Today, I'm joined by Eamonn Ives, researcher at the Centre for Policy Studies. Eamonn specialises in business and regulatory policy, devolution, and more relevant to this conversation, environmental policy. In his previous role as a researcher at the think tank Bright Blue, he authored a number of reports on energy and environmental policy, and is the author of the CPS's most recent paper, Driving Change, How Hydrogen Can Fuel a Transport Revolution. Eamonn, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on. It's a privilege to talk to you.
I was particularly interested in your report looking at the transport sector. In one of our previous webinars in this series, or podcasts in this series, we had Bruno Pryor. And Bruno was saying one of the problems with the whole debate around the environment is that most people tend to focus on energy. And actually there are three parts to this debate. One is energy, one is transport, and one is heating. Your report clearly focuses on energy, and you also talk about the use of hydrogen to decarbonise the transport sector. But before we get into the details of the research and recommendations, why do you think hydrogen generally has been overlooked in discussions about net zero?
So yeah, I think you're right in that hydrogen hasn't really attracted the same level of attention as perhaps other methods of decarbonisation, thinking mainly here of electrification. And that's certainly something which we touch upon in our report. And that's quite odd really, because hydrogen has a very long history. It was discovered centuries ago, and people have definitely been trying to implement it a lot more in the economy, and particularly since around about 1970, for various different reasons. People have really talked about the notion of a hydrogen economy, and putting it into all different sorts of applications, not least transport, but also in things like domestic heating and industrial processes. And you know, it has a lot of sort of evangelical supporters, and a fair few detractors as well. But yeah, you're right that it definitely hasn't received the same level of attention as other fuel sources. But I think that is now beginning to change, particularly as we learn how to make it in more sustainable ways and how to better incorporate it into everyday applications.
Now, in your report, you note that the transport sector is the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. I think in the figure you give is 28% of the total. What is it about the sector that makes it so difficult to reduce carbon emissions?
Yes, so transport is now the biggest contributing sector to domestic emissions in the UK, and it's been there for, I think, the last 3 years or so. It overtook the energy supply in around about 2016. But you're also right that it's also a sector which has proven incredibly difficult to decarbonise. So if we look at the economy as a whole in the UK, and we take transport out, the economy is decarbonised by about 50% compared to 1990 levels. Transport, however, has barely budged at all. It's maybe decarbonised 2%, maybe 3%. And looking at sort of surface transport, cars, buses, trucks, trains, all that sort of thing, emissions have actually gone up, and are going up at an increasingly quick rate, by about 2%. So it's certainly it's a real question about why transport hasn't fallen quite as quickly as other sectors. And some of those reasons are, you know, quite obvious. We have a bigger population nowadays, so more people equals more journeys by and large. The economy is also bigger, and also the way that the economy functions is a little bit different now. So perhaps you've been buying lots of Amazon parcels during lockdown, and obviously those goods to be transported right to your front door. So different patterns of behaviour are probably keeping emissions higher than perhaps we might want them to be. And that's probably, they can certainly explain away a lot of that difference. But also just generally, there are difficulties in trying to decarbonise things. So whereas appliances in the house, we may be able to improve their efficiency, we've not necessarily seen quite such big gains in the transport sector. And there are still some really puzzling questions, which I think is sort of where my report sort of comes in, hopefully.
So why don't we start at the beginning, as it were, for those listeners or viewers who don't know much about hydrogen? Why don't we start from the beginning? Why don't you talk us, first of all, about the use of hydrogen, how it could be used in meeting the needs of the transport sector, and maybe talk about some of the ideas that you put forward in the report. But also, let's start at basics. We're not talking about hydrogen powering cars as a sort of gas. We're talking about hydrogen being converted into electric. I think in the UK and Europe, we tend to talk about hydrogen fuel cell. In the US, they call it hydrogen electric, as opposed to the alternative, which is battery electric. And I know some car manufacturers have said that in the future, there will be two transmissions technologies possible. One is hydrogen electric, one's battery electric. Why don't you take us through that?
Yeah, so I think people are probably broadly familiar with sort of the battery electric car, or at least a hybrid electric, whereby you've got a big battery in your car, just like in your mobile phone, and you charge it up every so often to keep the battery topped up, and you can motor along like that. The hydrogen fuel cell is a bit different. In a lot of ways, it's actually quite similar to petrol or diesel in that you just you roll up to a station and pump it in, and you might get 300, 400 miles of range on a single tank. So it's certainly got that sort of familiarity aspect. But obviously the key benefit of hydrogen fuel cells is that they are zero emission, at least at the point of use, in terms of the greenhouse gases, which they don't produce, or the air pollution aspect, which is markedly lower in hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. I sort of touched upon that, I say, at the point of use, because hydrogen as a fuel still needs to be produced, and there are lots of different ways to do that. So in the debate, a lot of people talk about either green, blue, or grey hydrogen. I'll start with them in reverse order. So grey hydrogen is essentially any hydrogen that is produced as a byproduct of fossil fuels industry, and that can be done in different ways by perhaps taking methane or coal and reacting it under pressure with water, or steam rather, because it's very high temperature, and you kind of produce the hydrogen through that way. But as a side product of that, you get a lot of carbon emissions. So in terms of hopefully meeting something like net zero, that's not necessarily going to be a viable route to that. Blue hydrogen, on the other hand, is still sort of similar process as grey hydrogen, except you're hopefully just capturing those emissions before they can go into the atmosphere through various different technologies like carbon capture and storage. And then finally, we get to green hydrogen, which some people might be familiar with their school day chemistry lessons about electrolysis, where you kind of run a current through water and you can produce hydrogen through that way. At the moment, that produces about 4% of hydrogen globally, so it's still a relatively small proportion of total hydrogen production. But there's good reason to think that costs could fall quite soon. Maybe we'll get better electrolyzers. I know scientists sort of experimenting with different metals in the anodes and cathodes of these electrolyzers, and just generally falling prices of electricity could help in expanding the amount of sustainable hydrogen in the system.
So you talk a bit about how hydrogen is generated, and of course there are criticisms of the way hydrogen is generated or created in many ways. But also you talk about green hydrogen. It's very interesting. I remember talking to some professionals from the hydrogen industry, and they were telling me about the huge potential, for example, in creating solar farms in the Middle East, where you could create this hydrogen, and then you could use pipelines to transport the hydrogen to the markets in Europe and the rest of the world. Has there been much progress on that, or a real thought put into that, or is it really sort of much more based on a hope at the moment?
I think there is the hope that it could perhaps quite shortly become a much bigger part of the economy. And I think actually we're obviously here in the UK, and we're actually quite well situated to be leading in terms of sustainable hydrogen production. So one of the main ways you talk about solar farms, and of course that's a perfectly good way to get cheap, clean, renewable energy. The other big option is to do it by wind power, and the UK has really led the way in offshore wind, particularly on the sort of the east coast and into the North Sea, where you can there are quite favourable conditions. So not only is it incredibly windy, but the waters there are actually very, very shallow, and that makes siting the wind turbines relatively easy. So there's nothing to suggest that we couldn't really sort of ramp up that production of wind power and use that to feed into electrolyzers to create hydrogen. And there are questions about the extent to which we'd want to divert some of that power into hydrogen. But I think there's a very good case of doing that.
Now, tell us a bit about how this would work in practice. We say we want to see more hydrogen in the transport sector, but what does that mean in reality? Does that mean that people will be driving around with a choice of battery electric cars or hydrogen electric cars? I know some of the car manufacturers are talking about that being the choice in the future. We also see some car manufacturers, I think it was Daimler, who've just recently pulled out of hydrogen electric. Is it consumer cars? Is it really, you're talking about fleets? Is it more public transport? Where will we see hydrogen? Maybe you could talk about it being rolled out over time. How do you expect to see hydrogen rolled out over time?
Yeah, so I think in the personal car market, I mean, I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I don't think hydrogen is necessarily going to be widely adopted in there. I think it seems like electrification and batteries have pretty much cracked that. And that's not to say that some manufacturers are making investments in that. I think Toyota definitely are. I think the real opportunity for hydrogen is to be put into sort of heavier and more niche modes of transport. And actually, there's a good case that by doing that and sort of focusing on kind of discrete markets, like say buses or something, you can really build up the case economically to really invest in hydrogen. And that's certainly where my report at least hopes to focus.
Well, I've seen stories, for example, in the US. I know there's a truck manufacturer, for example, who I think it's Coca-Cola, one of the companies that have ordered a fleet of hydrogen electric trucks for the future. And we also see experiments with, for example, hydrogen trains. I know Siemens, for example, have developed one. I know there's been a conversion of old British trains to run using hydrogen. What can we expect to see in the future? Can we see? Is it only cars and trucks? Can we expect hydrogen trains? Can we expect hydrogen aeroplanes? What do you foresee in the report?
Yeah, so I think trains, certainly we take a little bit of time at least to look at. You mentioned Siemens, also Alstom in Germany, and I think Netherlands, they're starting to make developments there. I think the first test, although non-commercial, was taken in the UK last year. And yeah, hydrogen does seem to be quite a good way to decarbonise at least parts of the network which are quite rural or low capacity. So where it might be quite expensive to upgrade the lines to electrification, but also in places where you just probably can't electrify lines for various different reasons, perhaps space constraints. Maybe there are a lot of tunnels that you can't get the electric infrastructure to go in. But instead of having all that, you can kind of just have a hydrogen fuel cell contained within the train itself. And that offers quite a nice, elegant solution to really decarbonise those stretches of the railway where electrification probably isn't going to be possible without completely rerouting the existing line. So I think trains, we could definitely see some progress there. Other elements could be shipping, for instance, where the idea that you could convert a big super tanker to run on batteries is probably very, very speculative, at least at the moment. I'm not suggesting that we can't see major leaps forward in battery technology, but the idea that you could do that is probably quite speculative, and the sheer weight of the batteries necessary would just be too heavy. Aeroplanes and aviation, again, another sector which could benefit from hydrogen. Companies are starting to look at investing in hydrogen powertrains there. So I think there's sort of no end to the opportunities. I think you could feasibly put hydrogen into just about any mode of transport. I mean, it really comes down to the case of whether it's economical to do so or not. But yeah, I think there are certain limitations on batteries where hydrogen can fill in quite well.
Now, it's interesting, not long ago, I was looking at the car sector, and clearly you mentioned Toyota. I've driven, I think it was a Korean hydrogen car. I was invited to do so. And I was very excited when I saw there's a British company, I think it's called River Simple, that were building their own hydrogen cars. And when I tweeted this out, it was interesting the response I got back where people say, well, don't you realise how dangerous hydrogen is? There's still a perception that hydrogen is quite dangerous. I know there were problems in the early days when hydrogen hydrogen cars were being developed right at the beginning of the automotive industry. Has that perception been tackled? Are there still accidents happening? And how do we overcome these perceptions or the problems of hydrogen?
Yeah, I think there certainly is kind of that idea that it's potentially quite dangerous. I mean, we sort of think about early aircraft and things like that, which used hydrogen, and I'm not going to deny that there were some problems there. But I think as sort of time goes by and we learn how to sort of safely handle these products, that we kind of overcome those barriers. And yeah, so I think it's something which definitely we could probably do a bit more on, but I don't think there's sort of imminent dangers in that respect.
Why don't you talk us a bit more through the report in terms of how you see hydrogen be adopted, which sectors or which parts of transport you see adopting it, and how you expect the adoption to grow?
So I think sort of coming back to the first principle, the essential question which I was trying to answer in this report was basically, how can we ensure that every single vehicle in the UK has a secure and reliable pathway to not only meeting our sort of long-term ambition of net zero by 2050, but to start sort of cleaning up the air quite immediately. And we kind of approached it from the idea that we sort of knew that cars have quite a straightforward pathway. You know, as time goes by, more and more people kind of trade in or get rid of their polluting fossil fuel cars and switch to most probably battery electric vehicles. And I think that will just happen quite organically. To be sure, like the government does have some schemes already which are probably helping in that regard. But I think in terms of cars, at least in the personal car market, there's probably not much of a problem there. As we sort of turn our attention to net zero instead of the previous target, which was 80% by 2050, 80% reduction in emissions, that is, we obviously have to look at the whole suite of vehicles, and that includes sort of those heavier vehicles which have proven quite difficult and where certainly uptake of them has been a lot slower. So some data which is out there, which we got from the government, was regarding the adoption of what are called ultra low emissions vehicles. Now, some of these are going to be zero emissions, some will still use maybe a small petrol engine, but they're basically the cleanest types of vehicles that are on the market. And the government breaks down that data into different vehicle classes. And we found that in sort of the personal car market, so things you might drive to the shops or maybe to work, the adoption of those ULEV vehicles has really skyrocketed since 2010. So I think the figure was around about 14,700% increase. And that's obviously flattered by the fact that there were very few to begin with, but there's definitely been a marked rise in their adoption. When we looked at other vehicles, so that's things like buses or HGVs or even vans and motorcycles and things like that, the adoption has been a lot less in terms of percentage. So maybe about, I think it was about just over 500% increase, which still sounds like quite a lot, but it's clearly not the same amount that we're seeing in the personal car market. And that's obviously going to be down to a whole range of different factors, and we wouldn't hope to try and isolate one of them. However, one which kind of came back to us time and time again, and speaking to people in industry, was that the technologies that sort of are used in personal cars aren't quite as applicable in heavier vehicles. So we're basically talking here about batteries. And one of the things about batteries is, good as they are incredibly heavy things, and they have what maybe a chemist or an engineer would say a very low energy density score. And essentially that means that to get the power necessary to drive the vehicle's powertrain, you're going to need a lot of batteries in a heavier vehicle. And at that scale, it really does become noticeable, to the point where you might start to think, actually, we need to look for alternatives. And I think that's where we envisage hydrogen coming in, which doesn't necessarily run up against those same constraints, principally because hydrogen has a much higher energy density score than current day batteries.
Now, I'm at the Institute of Economic Affairs, you're at the Centre for Policy Studies. I know that we clearly come from a tradition which is naturally sceptical of government intervention, not necessarily always against it, and there are different views in a classical liberal tradition on the extent of government intervention. Do you, what sort of government intervention do you foresee? Do you actually call for government intervention in your report, or how much do you think this can be left to the market?
Yeah, so I think you're completely right, and I certainly approach this question with quite a libertarian perspective in my own personal politics. However, I think there are definitely questions in the whole sort of climate change debate, which I think even pretty free market people can get on board with, and perhaps some even go as far as to say that we have to get on board with this as classical liberals. So I think the most easy way to think about it is that climate change is by and large sort of a classic example of market failure. People put too much carbon into the atmosphere because they derive benefit from it, and those costs are shared among many different people. So I think there are sort of legitimate arguments for government intervention to sort of manage how that takes place, and I don't think too many sensible people necessarily are opposed to that principle. Now, you might have you might quibble about to what extent it can do that and how it should do it. But we think that there certainly is a case for government action, but it's obviously got to be marked and appropriate, and only take certain forms, and there are certainly better ways to intervene than others. So I think one thing which the government can do would be to basically sort of level the playing field between different fuel sources. And so only you have fuels which are polluting and are necessarily going to be exacerbating things like air pollution and climate change, then we can look and think about how the government can sort of tilt the incentives to hopefully try and increase the adoption of fuels which are not going to be doing those things. And there are clearly various different ways it can do that. So one which I was kind of particularly keen to include in the report was the idea around about basically what we call clean air zones. And these are sort of quite nebulous concepts. They can be voluntary, they can be legal. The government's definitely trying to roll more out in the country. But one of the most, I think, interesting things about them from sort of classical liberal perspective is that they can hopefully be the stepping stone for quite radical reformation of how transport is kind of looked upon from a regulatory perspective. Because they basically, well, at least the charging variety of them lay down the groundwork for quite a comprehensive system of road pricing, which I think my personal perspective is that classical liberals really need to get on board with this agenda of basically looking at how we tax motoring in the UK, and this seems like a good place to start to do that.
Now, you spoke about environmental damage, you spoke about pollution. Economists would refer to these as negative externalities, and clearly in tackling negative externalities, people turn to Pigouvian taxes. And people raise the idea, throughout this series, we've had debates about the idea of a carbon tax to help us achieve net zero. What's your own view on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big supporter of carbon taxes. I think we need to have more of them, and they need to cover more of the economy, and they need to be set at an appropriate level. And we can also look at how they interact with things coming into the economy, so imports and things like that. One of the kind of great sleights of hand on the UK's decarbonisation is that much as we've decarbonised domestic emissions, there certainly has been an offshoring of say, manufacturing processes, or perhaps some sorts of electricity generation, which kind of flatter our figures a little bit. So I think we definitely need to take carbon pricing more seriously. And if there was one sort of one thing which classical liberals could do to support prudent environmental policy, would be to really get behind carbon pricing. It seems like the most efficient way to deal with carbon emissions, and it certainly attracts support among economists. So I think that's something we definitely need to look at more. It's an elegant solution which basically works with the grain of human behaviour, and it really leaves it up to the individual as to how they want to change their behaviour. Someone might say that they want to continue driving their car, and they're more than welcome to do that, but they're going to have to pay a price if it's a particularly polluting model. Or they can say, actually, no, I might switch on to public transport, or maybe get an electric car, or if you're a bus manufacturer, you might switch to hydrogen production or hydrogen buses. So I think a broad carbon tax would be a brilliant thing to introduce, and would definitely support its introduction.
Now, one of the issues you mentioned there is the fact that we see smokestack industries closing down in Britain, in European countries, and elsewhere in order to help governments or countries meet their targets. Yet we see effectively pollution shifted or offshored or moved overseas. And one of the solutions that's been proposed is something called border adjustment measures, or effectively carbon tariffs on imports from countries that have lower environmental standards. Have you done any thinking around that? Have you got any thoughts around that?
We have. So a couple of months prior to the publication of my report, we actually published a shorter paper looking at carbon border adjustments, and essentially called for a tax to be levied on at least those industries where we can quite clearly delineate where there has been sort of a mismatch in the production of these goods, which are quite carbon intensive. They come into the UK and potentially undermine not only our own efforts, but our own industries in terms of say like steel production or coal production. They don't have to. British ones do have to pay these taxes, but the imports don't necessarily. So we can look at how border taxes can do that. It is an interesting question about sort of whole protectionism debate, and it's certainly a live one, and one which I think we need to talk about a lot more. I think in theory, though, I'm not. I probably come down on the idea that it's perhaps okay to do this, but certainly it warrants closer inspection.
Now, it's interesting. Here we are. Our opponents will probably say on the right, though we probably call ourselves classical liberals, talking about market solutions to tackling pollution and environmental damage. Yet when you look at the public debate, it seems, and many of the organisations that call themselves environmental organisations, they tend to be staffed or mostly populated by people from the left who claim that the right don't really care about the environment. It's the left, and only the left have solutions, and it's more government intervention. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that in the public sphere, at least, that the perception is that the environmental movement is populated by people on the left who say that they are tackling climate change and some of the problems, as opposed to us on the right who are coming up with market solutions? Yeah,
I mean, it's kind of a great sort of stereotype, right? Isn't it? That does get that sort of label gets tarnished. And I think to a certain extent, those on the left probably do have some legitimate grievances about the way that certain people in, maybe you'd say, the conservative movement have not necessarily embraced environmental causes. But that's not to say that none of us do. And there's definitely sort of a real groundswell among sort of right of centre actors or people who are interested in classical economics, free market economics, to really sort of look at these questions. And I think it really is incumbent upon believers in and supporters of free market economics to do this more. I think it's definitely been a bit of a blind spot in sort of focus for people like you and me of late. And there's a real danger in that we kind of abandon it to the sort of socialist left, whose solutions, I should say, are not necessarily going to be very helpful, and probably have more about expanding the reach of the state rather than any sort of genuine environmental concern.
Now, you and I are talking via Zoom because and usually we'd be our offices around the corner from each other, and either I'd pop into your building, or you'd pop into my building, we'd have this conversation face to face. So here we are during lockdown as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. And some people are saying that there are similarities and links between the actions taken during the coronavirus lockdown and actions needed for climate change. But we've seen what's happened when you've reduced economic activity so much, and the impact it has on the economy. But also you've seen a slight fall in emissions. What do you say to that whole debate? And when people try and draw parallels, do you think there are parallels to be drawn between both debates? Do you think we can learn something from the lockdown that we've just been through? And what conclusions would you come up with?
Yeah, I think it's been actually really interesting to look at sort of the coronavirus and the sort of the public policy outcomes of it through sort of the lens of environmentalism or climate change. And the two do sort of appear to have a number of similarities. A lot of people talk about coronavirus being sort of climate change in fast forward. And sort of I touched on before about sort of climate change being a public good problem. I think we'd say that pandemics are essentially a public good problem, in that there's this thing going around which is causing all these negative externalities, and it's sort of it's quite legitimate, I think, for government to sort of take at least certain steps to sort of protect people from that, and we can basically, well, most of us can get on board with having sort of our liberties curtailed at least for a short time to really address this threat. Climate change, again, is not entirely dissimilar, in that there's this public goods problem that sort of warrants a kind of a higher party to really sort of adjudicate there. I guess one of the interesting things is that, yes, we touch upon sort of those on the left of politics who've sort of looked at this and have said that, you know, emissions are now falling because economic activity is falling. I'm sort of less positive about that respect. I think, yes, emissions are falling. I think figures that I've seen sort of suggest around about 5, 6, maybe 8% lower in 2020 than 2019, or as it will turn out to be. However, I think in the at least medium to long run, the coronavirus actually will pose some quite tricky problems. So I think we're seeing already that a lot of the industries that have been disrupted are sort of the green industry. So deployment of renewable energy onto the system, projects that have been kicked back or maybe aren't going ahead anymore. In terms of environmental politics as well, we know that the COP26 is now going to be delayed by a year, and that's certainly not going to be terribly helpful in the long run in terms of decision making that needs to be made at sort of a international level. But I think yeah, like it's certainly an interesting question. There's a lot of sort of intersection between those two topics. So it will be interesting to see how it all plays out eventually.
Well, Eamonn, it's been a fascinating conversation, and I'm really grateful to you for focusing more on the transport sector, whereas previous conversations we've had have been more on the energy and a little bit on the heating. In summing up, if you like, you know, if I was to ask you to sum up the report and to sum up the main ideas in the report, your sort of elevator pitch, what would you say?
Yes, so I think the key question is that the economy is decarbonising, however, the transport sector appears to be stagnant. We need to look at why that is, and we can see that sort of personal cars are making quite good progress and probably will continue to do so. There's a big question mark about decarbonising heavier transport. And in the context of the 2050 target, well, we'll be needing to decarbonise every single vehicle in the economy. We need to look at having a range of options in how to do that, to make sure that the technologies are available to really sort of get each and every vehicle down to net zero. And we believe that hydrogen could become a very useful tool in doing so. And it could also be applied to a whole range of different contexts, not least heating, industrial processes. So it sort of makes sense to at least see what the government can do in terms of regulatory policy or its own sort of mindset when it approaches questions like climate change or decarbonisation. And we think that hydrogen needs to get a better hearing within not just the DFT, but sort of government at large. And by being able to draw upon a suite of different options, we'd equip ourselves with not only a better shot at reaching net zero, which we're currently not on target to meet, but we'll also hopefully deal with a whole range of other problems like air pollution and potentially creating jobs right across the country to do so.
Okay, so we've talked about hydrogen in the transport sector, but other than hydrogen, what other options do you see or would like to see more widely discussed in terms of decarbonisation?
So I think I'll sort of start with electrification, which might seem a little bit odd because my report was essentially suggesting that it could be risky to sort of fall back on electrification as a strategy to decarbonise every single mode of transport. But I think we can definitely look at where electrification could take a bigger role in the transport system, and it would be unwise to sort of dismiss it as being something only to decarbonise cars. So I think we are already seeing a lot of advances in battery technology, which could well make the case for electrification in heavier vehicles, and it will be good to see that happening. But we can also see it in other modes of transport, like trains. We probably need to ramp up the electrification there where possible. Another one would be modal shift. So that's sort of where we're talking about how can we get people out of their cars and maybe walking to where they need to be, or cycling. And one of the really interesting sort of dynamics with that is that it touches upon our planning policy. So if only our cities were a little bit denser, we might be able to live closer to where we need to work, or where we want to shop or socialize. And I think this is something which will only become more and more important as, say, our population grows. And I think the government, if there was one thing the government could do, it would be to look at how can we densify certain inner city areas, maybe like zones 1 and 2 of London, but elsewhere, of course. Let's allow ourselves to get people closer to where they need to be, so they don't necessarily need to rely on a car to travel 5-10 miles. They can actually just walk maybe 15-20 minutes, and I think that's quite manageable for most people. So that's an interesting thing. And I think it will also be interesting to look at how we could improve planning to improve the attractiveness of mass transit, so things like the train or maybe tram systems or tubes. So could we allow, for instance, a lot higher densities of housing around train stations in sort of commuter belts? I think that would allow people then to sort of, take a 10-minute walk to their closest station, jump on the train and get to where they need to be to work. And that could really still the incentives in favour of things like train travel. And that could really help in making the need for a car not necessarily so pressing. Sort of makes personal car ownership quite redundant. It becomes sort of a liability rather than an asset to have a car. So I think planning in that respect, we've certainly got a long way to go. But hopefully this government is willing to take the brave decisions to really push that agenda along.
It's interesting there you talk about densification. We've had a number of reports from the Institute of Economic Affairs where we've looked at this idea, and two of the ideas that you've kind of touched upon is the idea of building more around transport hubs. But that would go a long way to tackling some of the housing shortages, particularly in London. And also another issue is, if we look at the high street and the way the high street seems to be dying in many ways, if you allowed more mixed use in the high street, so you had a mixture of retail, live space, workspace, and had a much more dynamic high street, not only would you save the high street, but also you'd be able to tackle this issue of housing, but also tackle the issue of people not needing to travel so far.
Yeah, I think that's quite right. I mean, I think at least if you're someone like me, I much prefer the ability to sort of walk around and do more of my trips walking. I think it's a much more pleasant way to get around, and hopefully that is something which we can amend the planning system to allow for. I think it's nice to be able to do that, and yeah, like you say, we can kill two birds with one stone here by tackling not only carbon emissions but also air pollution, and then a whole other range of factors like the high cost of housing. If only we are to increase the supply of housing through, like you say, sort of mixed use developments and just more building in general.
Well, thank you for joining us, Eamonn, and can I thank you for watching or listening today. Don't forget to check out our previous episodes in this series. They're all available on our YouTube channel, IA London. You can also find the podcast version on Podbean. If you want to see more details of all our online content, once again, go to IA London on YouTube, check out our podcast on Podbean, or look at our website at iea.org.uk. To help us keep providing free content during these tough times, please do consider making a contribution, no matter how modest, by donating online at iea.org.uk. This enables us to continue producing this great content for free. Can I thank you all for watching or listening today, and we hope that you'll join us again soon. Thank you.